ask yourself the question, how can I do good to my boss today? How does this help my boss? So when in our workplace we need to embrace that idea of submission to the boss's authority, and also that we can also sort of begin to practice, so to speak, for those that aren't married, this idea of being a helper by viewing our boss as somebody that we want to be helping in a similar way as we might think of in the context of marriage. And then the woman's role as a nurturer is something else that we really have a great opportunity to practice in the workplace. We don't typically think of workplaces as very nurturing places. We have that expression, it's a dog-eat-dog world. Everyone's sort of out for themselves is kind of the idea of that. So because of that, when we do choose to demonstrate kindness and seek to consider others as better than ourselves in the workplace, that can be a huge testimony both to our boss as well as our coworkers. And no matter what context in which we work, we can demonstrate this kind of behavior. The verb nurture has three meanings. It can mean to feed and nourish, it can mean to train and educate, and it can mean to help grow or cultivate. So while we think of nurturing a lot of times just in the context of raising children, really take those definitions and think of them in the context of the workplace, and you see how many applications they have. You can be somebody who nurtures others that perhaps are under your supervision by training them, by helping them, by kind of cultivating them to grow in terms of their employment. You can do that in an attitudinal way with peers. You don't want to be asserting yourself as a supervisor if that's not your role, but you can still encourage them and help have a sort of attitude of let's help one another in areas where maybe you have more experience or competence, or it might just be sort of being somebody's cheerleader too. It may not be that you have any sort of skill specifically that you can teach them as it relates to their job, but you can encourage them in what it is that they're called to do. When you notice that they've done something well, you can say that. When you notice they're having a hard day, you can just try to encourage them in the middle of that. So there's a lot of ways in which we can demonstrate that kind of nurturing behavior towards our employer and our coworkers. So with all of that, some practical considerations and things that we need to think about. I don't know that our culture spends very much of any time thinking about these things, but depending on the context in which you work, there are lots of opportunities for danger, basically, particularly in our relationships with men. Meetings alone with colleagues. In some contexts, that's probably just normal and fine, but what do you need to think through as it relates to how you're going to do that in a way where you do have some boundaries that you don't need, that you can't cross? What about lunches and dinners out with people that you work with? Are you comfortable going out alone with a man that's a colleague at work? Is that appropriate or not appropriate? I don't think you can usually say, and I'll just say at the outset, I don't think you can universally say, oh, absolutely, it's never appropriate, or oh, it always is. I think that there's heart issues and there's cultural issues in terms of within the context of specific workplaces. But I think that what's important is it's important that each of us think these things through and get accountability in terms of what our standards are, and then stick to them, because there are dangers and temptations that can develop. One of the things is maybe that's fine occasionally, but it probably shouldn't become a pattern with the same person over and over again. Otherwise, that could be an indication that there's an emotional relationship developing that could be dangerous. That's one particular thought. There's also traveling for work. And that can create different situations. If you're traveling with colleagues and spending a lot of time with them, how do you do that in a way that is the best that traveling can be a fabulous time in terms of, sometimes when you're on the road and you're away from your routine, you can have lots more time to spend in the Word. It could be a wonderful time of refreshment in certain respects. But again, it's a matter of how have you thought these things through in order to safeguard yourself. And for us as women, I think the emotional attachment issue is probably the biggest one that that can lead into further temptation. In the workplace, we're with people for long hours of the day, sometimes in stressful situations. Sometimes people start sharing their personal lives and problems, and we don't necessarily want to avoid all of that, because there are great opportunities for the gospel in those kinds of conversations. But we also want to be careful that, particularly with men, we're not developing emotional attachments that could lead to illicit types of relationships. And even if it doesn't lead to anything that's, sort of crossing physical lines, particularly if it's a married man, he shouldn't be making his emotional attachment to us. He needs to be making it with his wife. And so we don't want to be taking that place, and it's not fair to him or to her if we're taking that place even in an emotional sense. So we need to be cautious about those kinds of things. Carolyn McCauley, and I'm just going to read this kind of extended quote because I think it's a very good warning, and she states it very well. We must be savvy about the emotional connections that can be made on the job. We as women, were designed by God to be helpers and to make men successful. We can't be oblivious to the fact that our encouragement, support, and promotion of our male colleagues can sometimes misfire in our own hearts, not to mention theirs. I've known many Christian women who have wrestled with their attraction to unbelieving single coworkers or even married colleagues. We can help each other here by listening carefully as our friends talk about their colleagues. Do our friends light up when talking about one particular person at work? If so, ask questions. It's better to be labeled a little nosy now than later to walk with your friend through the fallout of an immoral relationship or an adulterous affair. And we've talked about this a little bit already, but it's just and it goes to that bigger conversation of us lovingly being a part of one another's lives in a way that goes beyond just the fine, how are you? I'm fine, great, see you next Sunday. We need to be aware enough about what's going on in each other's lives that we can help each other see the warning signs before we go down dangerous roads. Another thing that I think is helpful in this regard is, to whatever degree you do have a relationship with other coworkers, try to, if it's at all possible, try to build relationships with their wives and their kids, because that kind of helps keep your perspective as to, it's a relationship with a family as opposed to just a relationship with this individual. That can kind of help keep the perspective right. And as I said, accountability is critical. A married woman in the workplace, her husband should be her primary accountability to those relationships, and they should be talking about those things, which will avoid many dangers. And for those of us that are not married, we can have those relationships with friends and other women, either in our workplace and or in our church body, who can help us stay accountable about those relationships. And we need to be alert to that in our own heart, but we also need to be alert on behalf of our friends. So as we started with the Proverbs 31 woman, as she does good to her husband, so the godly worker honors the Lord by seeking the best for her employer and striving to be holy in all of her actions. In the midst of a wicked world, our efforts are motivated by the love of Christ, and they're enabled by the Holy Spirit, which we don't want to lose sight of. And that's how we adorn the gospel in our relationships with men. So I'm going to jump into chapter 10, and we'll talk a little bit about how this plays out with our relationships with other women, which, interestingly enough, are sometimes even more challenging. Often is the case. And then we'll get to some time to maybe talk about what some of these practical implications are. I kind of tried to look at those relationships with women by kind of classifying some of the stereotypes. Now, obviously, in some cases, you may have one person in your workplace, and that person may be all of these things rolled into one. Or you might just see other aspects of that in terms of somebody who's, one of these things or another that you're challenged by. We've already talked quite a bit about gossip, and particularly as it relates to our own heart and our own communication of gossip. In this section, we're looking more at how do we respond to gossip in the workplace when other people are really involved in a lot of gossip. And it's not always easy. Because it's very easy for us to get sucked into people's gossip, and it's very easy to become part of it by participating or being sort of, just kind of part of it because we're there and it's happening and we don't take a stand against it and we continue to be involved. Proverbs, as we talked about before, is full of warnings as it relates to gossip. Proverbs 20:19 says, "He who goes about as a slanderer reveals secrets, therefore do not associate with a gossip." So we need to be really cautious that we don't get caught up in it. We need to try to excuse ourselves from conversations where it's happening. And if there's other believers that are involved in it, we need to graciously, and we'll talk more about the how-to of this, but we probably need to graciously try to, remind them that that's not an appropriate response. That's not something that we should be doing in the workplace. And that could make us the object of more gossip ourselves, quite honestly, as we take a stand against it. So we need to be sort of prepared for that reality. It may not, but it could. But if that's the case, then 1 Peter encourages us that we are to suffer for the sake of righteousness, if that's what the Lord has ordained. So he says, "Who is there to harm you if you prove zealous for what is good? But even if you should suffer for the sake of righteousness, you are blessed. And do not fear their intimidation, and do not be troubled, but sanctify your heart, Christ in your hearts, always being ready to make a defense to everyone who asks you to give an account for the hope it is within you, yet with gentleness and reverence." And one of the things that I would say, too, about that is, while on the surface people might ridicule you for not engaging in gossip, in that moment, they may crack a joke or something that's uncomfortable, but when they are in trouble in their own lives, when they have a concern and they know that you're not the person that's going to tell the rest of the office what's happening, it's highly likely that you're the person that they're going to come to when they don't want everyone else to know their information, because they realize that you may be the only person who's not going to share it with the rest of the office if they share something that's going on. And you want to strive to cultivate that trust in others, but you really also want to, and then you need to be really careful that you keep it if people have entrusted it to you, that you don't get tempted to share once you do have that information. Proverbs 16:28 says, "A perverse man spreads strife, and slander separates intimate friends." Just another reminder of how destructive in the workplace, or any context, but in the workplace in particular, gossip can be. Manipulation, the manipulative woman in the workplace. That's not something that any of us have ever experienced, right? Manipulation is something, I would say that the biblical term is manipulation. You will often commonly hear it in the workplace or in the world as passive-aggressive behavior. Passive-aggressive behavior isn't necessarily a biblical term, but manipulation is. And it's maybe not the only form of manipulation, but it's a really common one. Passive-aggressive behavior and manipulation can involve rebellion, laziness, selfishness. You might be talking about a coworker who is constantly avoiding conflict. They may use sort of like the silent treatment or the cold shoulder. They might use sarcasm to get their way. Sometimes it's Sometimes it's flattery, which kind of goes back to our encouragement conversation. We want to encourage when it's legitimate. We do not want to flatter. Proverbs 26:28 says, "A lying tongue hates as it crushes,